said to us after we had agreed that we were going to work for passage of fair housing legislation instead of relying on an executive order. He said, well, I'm getting ready to whip the teacher on this one, and I don't want you fellows running off on me. And I asked him to explain what he meant. He said that when he was a boy, he and some others had gotten together to whip the teacher that they didn't like down there in Texas. But when the actual point of contact came and he grabbed the teacher, he discovered all his friends were running off over the hill, and the teacher whipped the daylights out of him. So he said he didn't want that to happen. That's actually, that is where he later referred in his speech to my role, in which he said I was the only one who was urging legislation. Now, he, in his speech, said that he wasn't so sure he could win, and he wasn't so sure that I felt I could win, but he was wrong there. I felt we could win. But anyway, whatever it was, he did document the fact that I was the only one who...
This letter. Was this letter in relation to that?
No, that's in relation to that.
Oh, that's...
Actually, what happened on that was the day after Martin Luther King's assassination, and all of us were together to try to find out what we should do. Whitney Young and I had decided certain things that might be useful, and I don't know whether Whitney did it or I did, but anyway, we put them down on a little memorandum, and I think that's it. Lying beside him, which, as you notice, I'm sitting right beside. I just slid it.
Oh, that's that. If you could just point to that for us.
You mean the paper? Yeah, I'm reading.
No, there was a picture. You're right. That picture.
That is, I think, the memorandum that he had a written statement, and I had a written statement, and we decided that this is what we would try to do. Included in it was extra hard work for passage of the fair housing law. It so happened we were in a posture where it was just about to get through anyway, but Whitney felt that it would be nice to say that this is one of the memorials for Dr. King, and I agreed. I thought that technically we had it ready for passage, but it seemed to me from a historical standpoint it wouldn't hurt to call it a part of the memorial for Dr. King. Now this picture here with President Eisenhower is when we were trying to get him oriented to civil rights. It so happened that he knew Walter White very well, but I don't think he knew the rest of us there. And we were talking with him about making a personal appearance, which he subsequently did, and also some of the things that we hoped he would support, including, of course, the 1957 bill, which the Republican platform, as I told you yesterday, had supported.
Did the Democratic platform support that?
I can't remember. It may have. I think it did, but for the Democrats it would have been very easy to support. But for the Republicans it wasn't quite as easy. However, Hugh Scott really carried the ball on that.
Oh, he did. On the 57?
With respect to the Democratic National Committee.
Republican
National Committee. Yes, that's right. Because he, as I said, I can't remember whether he was chairman at that time or what, but he was a high functionary in the party. And of course, the picture below here is the day where we met with President Johnson. That's Senator Mike Mansfield, Justice Thurgood Marshall. It's Walter Pontrow in the corner. This person with the back turned is Dorothy Height, and there were others who were not shown in the picture, cabinet members and so forth. The purpose was to decide what we should do as a country in light of Martin's assassination. And while we were talking, as I remember, the riots were escalating right in the District of Columbia, so that after we left that meeting, we had another kind of impromptu session with the president to consider that point, and that worked out eventually. Now, let's see. This I believe it's just a little informal get-together we were having with members of the House, and that is Mondale and Congressman Peter Rubino. This one, of course, speaks for itself. It's in connection with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This one, however, is an informal meeting that I had with the President in connection with my retirement, and he and I wanted, well, I think both of us wanted to have a little session about some things that might be done, and in that I was stressing the importance of putting in blacks in the federal judiciary, and most especially I was talking about Nate Jones, because at that time it seemed very important to impress on the President that Nate was a superior lawyer who would be a great judge in the Sixth Circuit. Sixth. Yeah. And that is now. This, of course, is one with the Chief Justice. The Supreme Court has a system of orienting new judges to the positions. So the Chief Justice gives, or he, at least up until that time, he'd been giving little receptions for the new judges, and all the new appointees to the circuit level were there, and I was there as a guest of Nate and Juanita. But it was a very pleasant evening. They had a dinner, and I got to talk with many of the new federal circuit judges, and I was terribly impressed with their attitudes. Not terribly impressed, but happily impressed. Impressed with their attitudes for the most part. There was a lady, for example, from down in the Fifth Circuit at Georgia, who was very impressive, very liberal little lady. And there were some from the West Coast and others. Let's see.
If you could just go back to that one there, in which I broke in, and as a result,
which one?
The one on top, when you're talking about Johnson said we you aren't going to refer to the whipping the teacher.
Yeah. Well, actually, you see, the controversy was, should we ask the President to, as civil rights groups, to issue an executive order outlawing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing? The President did not want to do that, and Humphrey felt the same way. I felt the same way. I felt that we ought to be able to get a law passed, but most of my colleagues felt that this was a trap. They thought that if we agreed to an executive order, Johnson would thereby get off the hook and not have to work for passage of legislation. And as the President noted in his speech, I was the only one that said that we were going to work for legislation. And that was a more serious part. This part was more or less humorous, but when we got down to the question of exactly what we were going to do, things were a little bit more tense. Because right up until the time we actually clearly saw that we could win on housing, there were many people who thought that we had been had by the President. They thought that the President had wriggled out of yes, but I never thought that. I always had faith in him, because we had this private meeting, that one over there, and I knew on the basis of our conversation just what he was prepared to do.
When was that private meeting? That was also in 68 prior to...
That is correct. There we were discussing individual members of the Senate, and it was kind of thing, where you decide what you got to do to get a person to support you. And, it was interesting. It was somewhat confidential, and he said, "Well, now when you leave here, I want you to say that we and I have been discussing, I think he had a popular program or something like that. I said, this president be no way in the world for everybody to believe that I'd come over here and talk to you without mentioning civil rights. And of course, this is if you're interested, that one over there, here. That is right. Now, this is when he was appointed Solicitor General.
There's Hoover in there.
That is correct. And the president had us over. That's Ramsey Clark, Edgar Hoover, his wife and sons. Then this is Spingarn here, Arthur Spingarn, the president, Roy, and myself. They had us into this, well, kind of a little get-together about it. Now, this is historic because this is a picture of Senator Costigan of Colorado, who was a sponsor of the Costigan-Wagner anti-lynching bill. And that is Walter White. This is my wife, Juanita. And it was when we were working for passage of anti-lynching legislation. To my best recollection, that was the time I went over to testify in the Senate for the first time about lynching, because I had covered that lynching. Now, interestingly, the day I got there and waited, they didn't call me. However, I came back to Baltimore, not realizing that they were going to get to me the next day. The next day, they got to me. Fortunately, they had a copy of my testimony, and it was entered into the record. For many years, I knew that there should be such a thing, but I didn't know how to find it. Then somebody came along who wrote a book on lynching and found it, and he gave me a copy of it, the actual hearing. That, I think, was 1933. Now, this behind you is a picture autographed of the Maryland Court of Appeals. On that day, I was asked by the court, I think it was the year before last, I'm not sure, to induct the new members of the bar. They have a ritualistic kind of thing where you give a little speech and present the members, the new candidates for admission to the bar, to the court, and that's what that was. There are other pictures with me and the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, but I don't know where they are.
Yes, okay.
Now that thing down at Leadership Conference, I guess you know, is when I got an award.
Award, yeah, right.
I think it's the Humphrey Award. Let's see, what else? Anything else?
No, I guess it's just about it for now.
Now, of course, I have the seal of the state of Maryland for sentimental reasons. This was hanging in my son Clarence's senatorial office, and I asked him to give it to me for sentimental reasons.
Okay.
Now that over there is the thing with all those little pieces of...
Oh, you're right. I saw it, right.
I asked Seller to give me that because that was his personal copy of the legislation with his notes.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it was mounted very poorly so that it doesn't look very good, but it is historically significant. Let's see, what else? This of McCormick.
That's
it's self-explanatory. He and I had a very good working relationship. And of course, these other things are resolutions from the House and Senate, which I don't remember how he did it, but anyway, they've been converted to metal, you know.
Okay. If you could, I guess, begin the other part of this session by just talking about
intense Irish commitments. He also came from South Boston, the area where eventually we had so much trouble with school desegregation. But that, of course, was after his time, the trouble on school integration. when he was in the House as a member and later became Majority Leader and Speaker, we worked very closely with him, and he was a tremendous source of support on legislative matters. For example, at the time we were considering the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, there was a considerable amount of disagreement on whether it should include Title VI, which prohibits discrimination in federal grants and aid. Also, Title VII, which is the Equal Employment section. There were a number of well-meaning people who exerted a considerable amount of...
Talking about Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedys.
Well, no, I don't mean them. I'm not designating the people I mean.
Okay, right, okay.
But the people who exerted the pressure thought that if I insisted on having what I was asking for, we would lose the public accommodations, and they thought that public accommodations were so important that we ought not take a chance on losing it. But I'm pleased to say McCormick stood with me, and that he felt that we should try to go for the whole package, as did a number of other people, particularly in the AFL-CIO, the Andy P. Miller and Mr. Meany were very supportive, so that we eventually got the whole package. But without McCormick, we might have had a considerable amount of difficulty in the House.
Jumping ahead of this, unfortunately, Joe Rao had prepared a very good review of the whole process that led up to the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act, including, a lot of the politics and the positions of the Kennedys. Unfortunately, I haven't got it with me, but I left it in New York and I should have brought it there because it would have been helpful at this time. However, in that he goes into quite a good amount of detail regarding the position of the Kennedys, especially Bobby. Well, the Kennedys were opposed to various features of that bill, the initial proposals that were to be included in the bill, or features that were to be included in the bill. Could you just discuss, the differences with the Kennedys on that?
Well, I think it was not so much a question of differences with the Kennedys. It was a matter of differing with the broad spectrum of civil rights advocates who were so absorbed with the public accommodations question that they did not want to run the risk of losing it by, as they saw it, overloading the bill with things which, so far as they could see, were not as dramatic at the time. They felt that the public sentiment was strongly in favor of passing public accommodations legislation, but not as strongly in favor of what became Title VI and Title VII. The president, who at that time was President Kennedy, reacted, I think, in response to that general sentiment. Therefore, that put him on the side opposite from where I was. Right. And the same was true with Bobby, who was then Attorney General, and who seemed to feel that we ought to avoid these other kinds of things. Then there were some people who thought that if we put them in, we could use it for bargaining in the Senate, that is, have it in the House, and when we got to the Senate, we could offer to drop those if we could get public accommodations. And indeed, some political writers mentioned that, but that was never my intention. And whenever they asked me, I said, "No, we're not including anything for bargaining. We're including it for passage." Happily, the pendulum swung in the direction that Joe and I wanted, and we were able to get a considerable amount of support in the House among some of the Republicans who were people that we could depend on.
Would you care to name a few of those Republicans?
Well, I guess the man who was more or less holding them together was Congressman McCullough of Ohio, because he was the ranking Republican member on the House Judiciary Committee. But there was also a group of House members, led to some extent by now Senator Mathias from Maryland, who I think had come from a group which Adam and I had set up earlier.
Adam Clinton.
Yes. Anyway, however they got started, they did meet. I think they call themselves the Wednesday Club, but I'm not too sure. But whatever they call themselves, they did meet, and there were about 50 of them. They decided that they would go along with us, and I remember particularly Rumsfeld, Don Rumsfeld, who later became Secretary of Defense under Ford, I think, or Nixon. No, it must have been Ford. In any event, Don and I had an interesting experience in the beginning of our friendship, because at this meeting of this group of Republicans, I undertook to do as we always did, and that is count the actual votes that we had, which was one of the things that McCormick was so helpful in. We always counted every individual vote. And somebody asked me how many votes we had among the Republicans. That is, somebody in the group. I said, well, I think we have X number. I can't remember what the number was. Might have been 49 or something like that. From this group. And I said I had thought we had 50, but I read a story in the paper this morning indicating that one of the members of this group might not be willing to go along with us. And they said, who is that? I said, well, he's here, Congressman Rumsfeld. He said, that isn't true. He said, I am with you. So I like this frankness, and have many times had a little shared pleasantry with him about it. And we still maintain some little contact from time to time. He's out in private business now. I think he's head of some large company, but I'm not sure. He's one of the more constructive Republicans.
I'm going to back up a bit to the politics involving the politics that led to the 60 Act. Yesterday you mentioned the key features of that provision. However, if you could just give us a rundown, a review of the whole process that led up to that.
That's correct.
Right.
Well, there again, after we passed the 57 Act, we felt certain that we ought to use that as a base for attacking other kinds of problems. One of the first problems that we encountered was in the question of the power of the Civil Rights Commission to issue subpoenas and therefore get testimony from public officials about discrimination, particularly in voting and other matters. That case went to the United States Supreme Court, and the court did uphold that part of the law as constitutional, giving them the power to issue subpoenas. The other problem we had was when the Justice Department began trying to find documentation of what had happened in the places of registration, it was discovered that a great many of the records just weren't there, had been deliberately destroyed. So we knew we had to have some kind of legislation which would make it mandatory that the records be preserved. Then there were a whole series of terrible bombings of churches and synagogues, which we felt that we needed to try to get the government in some way, but there was always a question of how you could establish federal jurisdiction in a crime that really was a state matter. And we finally resolved on what I mentioned yesterday about the presumption that if dynamite figured in the matter, it had to move in interstate commerce, and therefore the Commerce Clause of the Constitution would give the federal government the power to intervene. Where we had a serious difference with then Majority Leader Johnson was he felt that we ought not try to resurrect Part 3, the bill which we had, the part of the bill that we lost in 1957. He was willing to go along with all the rest of it. He had another feature which somebody from Harvard had proposed, and that is a group that would try to explore possibilities of settling things through mediation. That eventually became a part of the 64 Act, but at the time we didn't have much enthusiasm for it because it looked like something which would be a kind of a weakening influence on some of the things we were trying to do. Then the other thing which was the real problem in trying to resolve, Joe Rao had developed a proposal which would get the Civil Service Commission or some other executive branch agency to serve in a capacity of determining whether people met the state requirements to be eligible for voting, and this would be submitted by the federal government to the appropriate state officials for inclusion as qualified voters. There were others who felt that this was a little bit too advanced, and they thought that we ought to have a system under which the courts could appoint referees after they had heard testimony about people who were contending that they were denied the right to register. These referees would then make the determination of whether the people were in fact eligible by standards set by the state, and also certify that to the judge, who in turn would order the state officials to put these names on the books. The weight of opinion at the time was that the referee plan was the better approach, and there was incorporated that feature. The problem, of course, with that was that you had federal judges who didn't want to expedite things, and that meant you didn't get as many people registered as you could have done under the Rao proposal. Of course, as we now know, the Rao proposal, with various kinds of changes, became the law in 1965, and that system is now in effect, where we have these what are called examiners who go down, make a determination of whether people meet the lawful standards to be eligible to vote, and that list is certified to the appropriate state agency. Then the state agency must put them on the books, so that as opposed to 60, where you could get maybe a few hundred people registered by the referee process, you could get thousands registered by the examiner process. It's interesting to note that if the proposal, which as I said was essentially Joe Rao's proposal, had been in effect, it never would have been necessary to have the March on Selma and the deaths and other things that went along with it. But that's a lesson you can only learn from history, and yet it is a fact. Now, we differed with Mr. Johnson as majority leader on his views, as I said, not wanting to include a new attempt to get Part 3, which we'd lost in 1957. And also this proposal, which is, to my best recollection, came from a distinguished lawyer up at Harvard. In any event, some of us were not quite as enthusiastic about the 1960 law as we were about 57. Nevertheless, it gave us an opportunity to try out a very important procedure, which had been the basis of our difference with Senator Morris in 1957. As I mentioned, in 1957 we used the procedure of bypassing the Senate Judiciary Committee. In 1960, in deference to Senator Morris, we used what he said we could do, and that is invoke the power of the Senate to discharge the Judiciary Committee. That was done, and this enabled us to get the bill to the floor of the Senate, even though Senator Eastland had not wanted to report it. So that it stands us in good stead now, because we, as the fight begins with respect to preserving and extending the 1965 Voting Rights Act features, we have it in the posture where we can use the bypassing system in the Senate, or we can use the discharge approach, or if the committee is fair, we can get it out by the regular process of the committee making a report. Obviously, we would hope we could do that, but if you can't, then we'll just have to use the Rule 14 and the discharge.
Rule 14 is the discharge.
No, Rule 14 is taking the bill from bypassing the committee.
The next step following the passage of the 60 Act, by this time now, Kennedy, well, this was the election of the 60s election. We have the whole, it's a completely new climate, a new phase in the civil rights movement. The sit-ins have begun. There's that agitation in the streets, moving into the streets as such. The whole demonstration protest movement is now on the way. Kennedy is elected. How did you move from here? What was first of all, what are your feelings towards civil rights demonstrations then?
Well, so far as the demonstrations were concerned, it seemed to me they were important from the standpoint of building a climate of opinion. But of course they weren't new, because we had demonstrations as far back as the 30s, and even before that. There is a historic picture in the NAACP, of course, about the anti-lynching street demonstrations that were held. Then, as I may have mentioned in other interviews, in the 1930s, there was a tremendous movement in northern cities in which people demonstrated in the streets. Adam Powell had a campaign in New York where people went down, paid their utility bills in pennies. In other words, it was definitely not new for people to stage confrontations. What was new was the location. The cities or other areas of the South had not been used before to any great extent. Some had, but not to any great extent. There was also, of course, the aspect of public accommodations, which was the dominant theme at the time. Many people don't realize that the demonstrations about public accommodations did not begin in North Carolina, as the press likes to say, but began in Oklahoma, and that was extensively documented in an article in Life magazine. The demonstrations were staged largely under the direction of a lady, Miss Clara Looper, who was an NAACP official. There was a discussion of this as a technique in the St. Paul Convention of the NAACP, and some of the students who attended that convention put it in effect in North Carolina. So from a historic standpoint, the demonstrations which began in North Carolina were really a continuation of demonstrations already started. I documented that rather extensively in an article I did for the University of Nebraska Law Review. And in addition, of course, you can't argue with the pictures that appeared in Life magazine that showed these students in Oklahoma actually carrying on the work. I say that merely to indicate that there are people who think that blacks didn't get worked up about their civil rights until the demonstration in the South, but the fact of life is that this was part of a continuing effort. I necessarily had to think that it was desirable because I felt it would influence public opinion, but also my own children were heavily involved. My oldest son, Clarence, was one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My middle son, Michael, was heavily involved, even to the point of being attacked by the police because of his demonstrations and things of that sort. Also, many of these young people who are floating in and out of the office here, like Kenny Brown, were key demonstrators in those days. But what was lacking, of course, is the coordination of that with the actual getting of votes in the Congress, and also the registration of people. One of the hardest jobs that Mrs. Mitchell had in Maryland was to get the young people who were demonstrating to participate in getting people to register to vote, because the young people enjoyed the demonstrations, and they were tremendously clever in doing it. But they didn't like the kind of humdrum process of getting people to register, and it was necessary to stand behind them on that matter. But then, of course, what was needed was activity in the areas where we had members of Congress who were against what we were for, and there wasn't much of that. So that while there was built up through the demonstrations a tremendous body of opinion and sympathy, the political punch had to be gotten in other ways, and we did succeed in getting that. But
this is where you came in now.
Well, this is where people with whom we were working, for example, the labor groups had much influence in many areas where black operation as such was not having a political impact, and they provided that political impact. Also, the church groups out in the Middle West were especially helpful, because there we didn't have much black support, and we didn't have much labor support, because the labor people weren't well organized politically out there. I would say that in the Midwest, that would be in states like Iowa, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Utah, and places of that sort. I guess Utah would fall more into the mountain state category, but anyway, I mentioned the Dakotas and Iowa and Nebraska. There's where we really needed some kind of public opinion, which would be helpful, and that came largely from religious and civic groups who were after the members of Congress and senators that we had trouble with. For example, one of the senators who was important to us was Senator Haruska, that's H-R-U-S-K-A, of Nebraska. And that senator was not easily influenced, but I would like to think that between the efforts of church people and President Johnson, and of all people, Senator Dirksen, we were able finally to get him to be cooperative.
The election of President Kennedy brought a new mood to the country. It opened a new phase, the whole process of looking at the nation.
That's right.
It was a new vista.
Right.
Very progressive. How much did Kennedy's approach to civil rights or to progressivism affect or help you in your work?
Well, it's difficult to say, because the president had a somewhat troublesome problem. He did not have the kind of influence
President Kennedy?
As I said, President Kennedy had a somewhat troublesome problem. He did not have the kind of influence, for example, in the Senate that he needed in order to get legislation passed. In addition, he was very interested in foreign policy, and the civil rights problem, while important to him, is my judgment, it didn't rate as high on the agenda as foreign policy and things of that sort. In addition, we had a difficult time getting people to understand that there had to be a very broad attack on civil rights problems. There were those who could see very easily public accommodations, for example, and I think they could even see the importance of having something that would prohibit discrimination in employment. But they weren't prepared to take the big bite on everything, and indeed there were those who had expected that President Kennedy was going to issue an executive order against housing discrimination. It was slow in coming, and therefore many people decided they would start a campaign of having pens sent to the White House urging the president to issue this executive order. President Kennedy, of course, was so charming and popular with people that very few wanted to be critical of him. And it was very important to try to couch your criticism in terms of absolute fairness and also in terms of giving him credit for what he was doing that was right. But he was not very active in seeking legislation. He eventually got together a package which many of us considered unacceptable, and that went over to Congress, but we did not support that. We felt it ought to be a much broader proposal, and eventually we did get a broader.
So that will come right back to his proposal in 1963. Is that what we're talking about?
I think that was the time he proposed it. I can't remember.
Was there any action in 1961?
On legislation?
Yeah, right. Mike had referred to some sort of action in 61 that included.
I believe that was at the time when we were trying to get the Senate rule changed.
Okay, that was another big struggle.
You see, every year that a new Congress came into session, we would try to get the Senate rules amended to improve Rule 22. That's the rule covering filibustering. But always we had problems on that. One of our constitutional arguments was that the Senate, each time a new Congress begins, is a new body and therefore can make its rules as a new body. Our opponents argued that the Senate, unlike the House, is a continuing body, and therefore its rules continue between Congresses and were controlling, which meant that you couldn't amend Rule 22 except by referring it to committee and having the committee make a report on which the Senate could vote. We argued, of course, that the Senate could initiate on floor actions which would change the rules.
How did that eventually work?
It eventually worked out that the Senate improved the rule to some extent. It's a very complicated thing, and I don't know whether you want me to go into it, but I'll try to telescope it if you want me to.
Yes, please.
What happened was a rule had been adopted in the Senate after a filibuster following World War I, in which it was required that 2/3 of the senators had to be gotten if you were going to invoke cloture, to shut off debate. We had a big fight about that.
That was 2/3 of the senators present, or 2/3 of the actual body?
My memory's a little hazy on it, but for all practical purposes, it meant 2/3 of the Senate, because everybody always turned up and you had a full complement. I could go back and look at the technical language, but actually, if you wanted to win, you had to have 2/3 of the Senate. But then we had a effort to change the rules back in the 1950s, I believe.
That's right.
When Senator Wherry of Nebraska, that's W-H-E-R-R-Y, was the leader of the Republicans, and there was developed what was called the Hayden-Wherry Compromise. Hayden being Senator Hayden of Arizona. The compromise provided that if you were going to invoke cloture, you had to have 2/3 of the Senate present and voting. And in addition, you could not change the rules by a direct vote. You'd have to go through the process of changing rules by going to committee first. And if you did, the rules limiting debate did not apply to efforts to change the rules. So that in effect they were saying that if you conducted a filibuster against the rules change, there really would be no way to break it.
Right. That actually, the Hayden-Waring compromise really tightened the whole filibuster.
That was our belief, and we felt that it strengthened the hand of the filibusters rather than leave. There was one aspect, however, which might have been an improvement. Before the adoption of the Hayden-Waring compromise, the cloture did not apply to a motion to take up a measure, so that if you started a filibuster against a motion to consider a measure, there would be no way that you could stop that filibuster except perhaps exhaustion of the members. However, in the Hayden-Waring compromise, it was added that the cloture would apply to a motion to take up, as well as a motion when substantive matters were on the floor. Thereafter, we were able to get a change in the rules, which reduced the number of senators required for invoking cloture.
We're now up to 6 to 1 then.
That is correct. And let me see, I don't remember whether that was 6 to 1. I would rather not try to give the dates on this, and I wouldn't want to give too much of the substance since it's so highly technical. I wouldn't want to have an error permanent part of the record. But I would say that as of now, we have an improved situation in the Senate. But it's ironic because our opponents argued always that as minorities we really needed to be protected by the filibuster rule, and that we would rue the day of changing the rules. It so happens that there have been several times in recent years where our supporters have had to resort to filibusters in order to try to stop dangerous attacks on legislation that we're interested in. And the Senate rule has made it easier for those filibusters to be killed. And it is kind of a burlesque to see the roll call where you have people from Mississippi and other southern states who always said the filibuster was so sacred, voting to cut off debate when it involves people such as what Senator Weicker has been of Connecticut has been trying to do recently to protect against things like the Helms Amendment, which was an anti-busing amendment, or Senator Bennett Johnston's amendment.
The question of congressional leaders at this time was also crucial to your efforts.
Yes.
We had, on the Republican side, very colorful Senator Dirksen,
right,
who played a key role in marshalling the support of the Republicans.
That is correct.
Could you describe Dirksen's role as related to the 64 Act?
He was indispensable in the 64 Act. Senator Dirksen was a good personal friend of President Johnson, and that is why when we were talking about who was going to try to get what person to vote, we said Senator Dirksen was President Johnson's personal assignment. In turn, Senator Dirksen was able to get some of the conservatives that we probably could never have gotten in the Senate to support the legislation. But the route that we had to take gave consideration to Senator Dirksen's pride of authorship. In other words, we had a bill which was, in our opinion, very desirable and effective. But as long as it carried the authorship of liberals, it was very doubtful that we could get Senator Dirksen to be enthusiastic about it. So it was agreed by all parties that Senator Dirksen would be given an opportunity to read this whole thing over and work such changes as he thought would be helpful, provided, of course, it didn't do violence to the main objective. And when he got through, we would call this the Dirksen Bill. And this satisfied him to the extent that he really worked very diligently, checking the commas and semicolons and phrases, coming out eventually with a bill which was not very different from what we had proposed in the beginning, but which he enthusiastically supported.
Yeah. One of his key staff members, Neil Kennedy,
yes,
explained that Dirksen's view of the filibuster was that it was an important tool for arriving at a consensus. He was always very much concerned about consensus. What were your views of Dirksen and the filibuster as such?
Well, I never thought that Dirksen was so concerned about consensus. I think he was essentially a person who had some pretty good personal instincts, but reflected to a large extent the conservatism of the Midwest. As you know, he came from Pekin, Illinois. I had known him in the House, where he usually went along with what were civil rights proposals in those days, such as anti-lynching, outlawing the poll tax and things of that sort. When he came to the Senate, I had what I thought was a friendly relationship with him, even to the extent that he once before election in Illinois had a film shot with me on the front of the Capitol, in which Senator Dirksen came up out of the background of a brilliant sunset, I think. He was a rather impressive looking person anyway, and would approach me and we shook hands. That was the thing he was using in his campaign in Illinois. And I think he must have thought it was in some way helpful to him. I'm not sure how it was, but in any event, we had a friendly relationship, and as I said, I think his views were more of the views of the conservative Midwest, and I don't think he was as concerned about getting a consensus as he was about getting what he considered an appropriate remedy for a problem. That became clearer in 1968 when we got the Fair Housing Bill, because he made a speech on the floor of the Senate in which he explained his difficulties in getting support for fair housing, as opposed to how he was able to be successful in getting votes in 1964, and mentioned Senator Haruska, the person I referred to earlier, as an example of what kind of problems he had. I might say, too, that the senator had a strong sense of remembering who helped him in his campaigns. For example, we had a very difficult time after one of his elections I went in to see him, and I was accompanied by a black Republican from Illinois. His greeting to me was, "Clarence, you're through. Don't come in here anymore." This was in his office in the Senate. He said, "You and all the others out there in Illinois didn't do anything to help me in my election." And then he mentioned how John Sengstack of the Chicago Defender had once gotten some tickets to something from him. I think it was a football game or something. Whatever it was, Dirksen felt that Sengstack, remembering those tickets, should have therefore been for him, and wasn't for him to the extent that he thought he should have been. There was a man running against him who was still in Congress, and that is Sidney Yates of Illinois. Dirksen was so difficult that finally I said, "Well, Senator, no need of my staying in here arguing with you. I'm going to go out. I just come in to greet you and to bring in your constituent who is a Republican."
Who was that?
That was, you would remember his name if I could call it. He was very active in the NACP. I perhaps will remember it in a minute. But in any event, I left this man in with him, and they had a long little discussion, about Republican politics and that kind of thing. It's important to remember that the man who was running against Dirksen, Sidney Yates, was very popular on civil rights, in civil rights circles, because he was consistently a supporter of civil rights and liberal causes. When we got outside of the senator's office, as I was walking down the corridor with this gentleman who was with me, he said, "That Senator Dirksen," he didn't seem to be able to say Dirksen, "that Senator Dirksen is a very difficult man," he said. Remember now, he's a Republican talker. He said that, "I'm so glad I voted for Sidney Yates."
The interplay between the congressional leadership at this stage was also key to the whole political activities on the Hill. Senator Humphrey was then the whip, leading the fight in this regard.
That is correct.
Senator Mansfield was Senate Majority Leader.
That is right.
How would you describe their roles? How did they function?
Well, we felt, and this was largely something that Joe Rao and I tried to engineer, we felt that as outsiders, we had to have access to the majority leader or whoever was in charge of the legislation on the floor. But we also knew that that was almost impossible with Senator Mansfield, because he was irritated at the thought that people not in the Senate would be having access to him as majority leader on legislation which was before the Senate. In fact, he made a speech one day on the floor of the Senate when Joe and I were sitting in the gallery, saying, "I want to say to those on the outside, attend to their business and let the Senate of the United States attend to its business." So we knew that we would have a very severe handicap if we had to work with him as majority leader. And we also knew that we might have some problems working with Dirksen as the Republican leader, although it probably wouldn't be quite as difficult. So we said to President Johnson, "We hope you'll use your influence to see that Senator Humphrey is the floor leader on these things, because we just fear that it would not be productive to work with Senator Mansfield, even if you could get to talk to him." So I don't know how it was done, but it did develop that Senator Mansfield really passed the mantle of leadership to Senator Humphrey, and Senator Dirksen passed it to Senator Thomas Kuchel, that's Kuchel, of California, which was wonderful from our standpoint because we always had direct access to them, and we got along very well. As I said, I don't know how or whether President Johnson actually set that up. I think he did, and because he still had a lot of influence in the Senate. And Mansfield was very cooperative with Johnson personally.
Yeah. What type of person was Mansfield? Did you find? How were your relations with him?
They were not quite the way I would like for them to be. For example, with all of his faults, it was much easier for me to deal with Senator Dirksen than it was with Senator Mansfield. He had a tendency to be somewhat aloof, and as I said, which is indicated by his Senate speech, he seemed to think that Senate business should be handled by senators, and we poor mortals on the outside ought to not get involved too much. And sometimes it was a very unfortunate attitude on his part. I remember once he had done something which I thought was very commendable, and I went to his office to thank him, but really I got such a cool reception, and about a minute of his time when he was virtually walking out of the door in what I considered a manner utterly lacking in courtesy, that I regretted very much that I had gone in there to thank him.
Humphrey at this stage was in full bloom as a supporter of civil rights.
That is correct.
Could you go into some detail in your recollections of Humphrey as a politician, as a man whom you knew as a friend?
Well,
when did it start? When did your friendship with Humphrey start?
I can't remember the exact time because it was of such long duration, but I can say that my views on him really include the time when he was head of what was called the Works Progress Administration in the New Deal up in Minnesota, and the image I had of him came largely from a doctor who is now in Chicago, Paul Boswell, who was one of my schoolmates at Lincoln, and who had started his medical training at the University of Minnesota. Humphrey, in his capacity as whatever he was in the WPA, had been very helpful to Dr. Boswell, who was then still a student, of course, and they had a good relationship, which, as I said, gave me an image of then Mr. Humphrey as a fine person. In addition, he was a very good friend of Cecil Newman, who was the editor of the black newspapers up there, the Minneapolis Spokesman and St. Paul Recorder. That also helped to enhance his image. When he became mayor of Minneapolis, he had a tremendous civil rights attitude. Also, as you know, he was one of the leaders in getting the 1948 Civil Rights plank in the at the Democratic National Convention. When he came down to Washington, we then really had a very close working relationship, and among other things, we got started on a program of trying to end segregation in the armed services. He got together a committee which was made up of people from Minnesota mainly, and all of us went over to the Pentagon to argue with the military about ending segregation in the armed services. He also was very promptly introduced civil rights legislation. My recollection is that the first bill he introduced was an anti-lynching bill. So it was one of those things where the friendship grew so subtly that it's very hard to identify the beginning point. When we got to the place where you could just sit as you and I are sitting now, talking, and be completely frank with each other about our hopes, fears, and views on various things. We eventually got to that place where I felt perfectly free in discussing things with him, and I'm reasonably certain he felt free in discussing even confidential things with me.
It would be so easy to ask you in what areas or to the extent to which you agreed, but we know the areas in which you agreed. How did you differ? What are some of the areas in which you differed?
To be honest, I cannot recall any area in which we had a disagreement. As two people with strong views, I suppose there must have been times when we did not agree. But
would it have been more on tactics or approaches to overcoming, to legislation or overcoming a problem or getting around a problem?
I don't think so. I think that almost automatically we were in tune on how to meet a problem. There is an instance which would illustrate our kind of relationship. The dairy interests of the country and a number of other people wanted to get legislation passed which would give the states jurisdiction in federal enclaves. That would mean that state law would apply, say, at a military establishment or national park and things of that sort. Apparently the dairy interests are concerned about it for something related to taxes, and there were other people who wanted to protect their civil rights. For example, if you were a resident in a military enclave, you would have trouble finding an appropriate forum to get a divorce or get an adoption of children. Perfectly simple and laudable things, but because there was no appropriate forum, you just couldn't carry those things out. So you had people who apparently had some financial interest concerned and people who had altruistic interests who wanted to give the states jurisdiction in federal enclaves. On the other hand, we did not want that because it would mean that sheriffs and policemen could run on a military establishment in the South and arrest people as they had done. And we had been able to win in some of those cases because it's clear they didn't have jurisdiction to go on and arrest anybody. In addition, you had the question of whether you could have complete absence of segregation on military enclaves. We had big fights about whether veterans could use the swimming pool in a Veterans Administration installation, for example. And some people argued they couldn't do it because state laws required segregation, so that we were against that. Now, that sounds a little bit complicated, but I'm giving it to show how Senator Humphrey and I had a different approach. Apparently, because he didn't see the civil rights implications of this, he became a sponsor of legislation which would help to get state jurisdiction in federal enclaves. But when and at that time, Ramsey Clark was head of what was called the Lands Division in the Department of Justice. It was the function of the Lands Division to try to get this legislation passed. Humphrey and Javits was for it too, interestingly. because I'm sure neither he nor Humphrey realized the implications. But when we pointed that out to Senator Humphrey, he set up a meeting in his office with Ramsey Clark and some of the people who were urging this legislation. And I was there representing the civil rights interests. I'm not sure that anybody else from civil rights was there, but anyway, we had the meeting. And it was so interesting when I got to explaining our problem. Ramsey Clark, who always a very sensitive person, seemed just deeply ashamed that he had been any party to this, and never gave it any further real support. But the legislation came out of committee, went to the floor of the Senate, and the best version I can get of what happened was it was on a consent calendar, and I was not actually present in the Senate that day. Senator Humphrey had charge of the consent calendar, or if he didn't have charge of it, he stepped out to go to the bathroom off the Senate floor, and Senator McClellan of Arkansas got this bill through. But when I explained to Senator Humphrey how awful this was, somehow he got a procedure which I could check out if I wanted to. He invoked a procedure in the Senate whereby this bill was recalled, and it never got passed, which was very unusual. I mentioned that to show the kind of commitment that he had.
As an aside, at this point, it's been noted to me that one of your sources of strength in lobbying was your extensive knowledge of House and Senate rules. How did you come by it? Just your own discussions here indicate to me that how knowledgeable you were with all of these rules. How did you come by that? Was it a process of assimilation?
I think I have the Southerners to thank for that. I made a very careful study of their techniques, which, even though they were a minority, enabled them to control. It was because they had very full knowledge of all the rules and could apply those rules in a way that was helpful to them. Very often, the opposition, which of course would be our people, had more votes, but simply didn't know how to meet rules challenges, and the result was it would be lost on the technicality of rules. Now, it seemed that the best thing to do to meet that would be to make careful study of the rules. In addition, Congressman Richard Bowling of Missouri, my very, very good friend, he was a real authority and still is on House rules. So I learned a great deal from him. And in the Senate, of course, I learned by just being present when there were discussions of which rules would apply in a given situation. And very often, the fact that you could make an effective argument on rules really could be a lifesaver.
Bowling is still alive. Is he still?
He's not only alive, but he has just retired from the Congress. He will not run for re-election.
Okay.
But he intends to have a continuing impact on Congress in various ways. Last year, I agreed to serve on a committee which he set up of members of Congress and public people, which may still be in existence, and he may resurrect next year after he finishes his term. He had had a serious heart problem. He had to have a bypass, and his wife died, all of which I think influenced him to decide that he was going to retire. In addition, of course, I think he feels that there is a need to get the public aware of things that have to be done to improve the functioning of Congress. And he thinks that maybe doing it on the outside would be more effective than trying to stay in Congress. It's a real loss because he was chairman of the Rules Committee in the House, that is now the chairman, and also was a great source of strength through the years on civil rights matters.
Coming back to the whole politics of the civil rights legislation and the Act of '64, we have discussed Dirksen, Mansfield, Humphrey. Who are some of the other key senators involved in this process?
Well, of course, as I said, Senator Paul Douglas was of great importance, and Senator Philip Hart of Michigan.
Yes, if you could just talk some more about Philip Hart.
Well, Senator Hart was one of those people that had no enemies in the Senate. He could deal with any member, whether he was for or against him, for or against the principles that the Senate stood for. As an example of his place in the thinking of other members of the Senate, when we would want to have a strategy meeting of senators, Republicans and Democrats, the question would always arise, where can you have the meeting? Because some senators who were sensitive on their status would not want to go to another senator's office for a meeting, and at the same time they didn't have enough influence to convince some people that we might want to come to their office. We never had that problem if we said we'd meet in Senator Hart's office. Everyone would come, and we could have very productive discussions. In addition, he was so sensitive on the problems of people who were the victims of discrimination that you almost felt he literally suffered as he thought about the problems that people faced. My friendship with him began when he was, I think, lieutenant governor in Michigan. Whatever, I can't remember which position he had, whether he was attorney general or lieutenant governor, but whatever he was, I was up in Michigan and got to know him. And of course, when he came to the Senate, our relationship was enhanced and very, very firm. Then, of course, there were people like Senator I don't want to leave people out, that's my problem. Senator Douglas I had mentioned. Interestingly, at the time we got into the fight for the '64 Act, Senator Douglas was so concerned about economic matters that he was not quite as visible in the fight as he would have been in earlier years. Nevertheless, he was an effective friend in carrying on the fight. In that article that I referred to, the Nebraska Law Review, I did list the captains in the Senate, and for the most part they were people who carried on the leadership in the Senate. And there, I certainly should never leave out Senator Case in New Jersey, because he was really a person with deep personal commitments on these things. Then there was, as I said, Senator Keiko of California, who was really a wonderful individual. In fact, I hope that if this record is ever made available, that is a spoken record is ever made available, that somehow we'll splice in the names of the other people, because I certainly would not want to offend their memories or fail to show my appreciation by leaving their names out.
We're going to switch back to the streets and to the South and to the other phase of the civil rights movement, that is the demonstrations. Martin Luther King and the others were active, but King had taken a commanding role at this time. How did you view his activities?
In what way do you mean?
Well, overall, to what extent were they helpful? To what extent did you differ on more or less strategies?
Well, I didn't have any differences with him on his strategies, except for one thing, and that is I did not believe in peaceful nonviolence. I felt that you had the right of self-defense, and if you were attacked, the Constitution gave you the right to counterattack. So I could never accept the philosophy of letting your enemies kick you around, spit on you, and do all the other things.
Because you're a born fighter too, right? In that regard, especially in the defense.
I think
just thinking of you just your own personal life, going right back to.
Well, I think I had two approaches to it. First, my inner instincts are not to start a fight, but if anybody wants to fight, they make sure they get all that they are seeking in the way of a worthy opponent. And the other part of it is I have considered very carefully the legal implications.